Yeah, so to answer your question in short, no, this is not for publishing. This is purely for demoing and just to get the controller code hooked up real fast.
Okay.
So what we're seeing here is me getting killed momentarily. Let's get away from these dummies. But you can see the reticle moving around. So the variable that I put in there is called reticle distance. Now, because there's no mouse controlling the reticle, it used to be that the reticle would be in the same position as the mouse cursor. See, I think you can see me moving the mouse cursor around here.
Mm-hmm.
And in keyboard and mouse mode, the reticle would be, like here. They'd be the same. But because I'm using the controller input, I'm doing things a little bit differently. Instead of moving the reticle with the joystick, I'm saying, what angle is the joystick pointing? Like, is it pointing up? Is it pointing down? Is it to the left? And then I calculate a vector from the center of the screen of a certain length, and I move the reticle over there. Because if you'll remember from our original code, let me move. There we go. Or I'll just die. There we go. Pause. Okay. If you remember from our original code, the reticle would move around following the mouse, and then the character would know where the reticle was and would adjust itself to point in that direction. So I wanted to keep that same logic. I wanted the logic where the character would point in the direction the reticle was currently at. So it would be using the reticle to determine the correct facing angle. And instead, I wanted to control the position of the reticle as a side effect of how the joystick was oriented. So one of the things that I had to deal with was, well, how far away from the player do I make the reticle? So at its maximum distance, it's going to be 150 pixels away. So when it's completely all the way to the right, or all the way to the left, all the way up, it's 150. But if you've looked at the controller inputs before, the axis, you'll know that they start at 0, 0, and they go up to about 1, 0, 1, 1, whatever. They limit out at 1, where 1 is the maximum extension on that axis. So +1, -1, +1, -1 for x and y respectively. And so I take a vector where the maximum length of that vector is 1, and I multiply it by the reticle distance. So when I'm barely moving the joystick, the length of that vector isn't 1 yet. So I multiply that by 150, and what that allows me to do is move the reticle just a small distance away. But when I have the joystick fully on, like all the way to the edge, then that reticle is going to be about 150 pixels away from the character at any one moment. So it gives me a nice sense. The purpose of this was, I could have just said, if the joystick is pointing, boom, push it all the way out. But that doesn't give me a sense of, like, how hard am I pushing the joystick? Am I doing it just a little bit? And the reason I needed that was because you'll notice that as I move the reticle, he doesn't start walking right away. So it doesn't actually start walking until the reticle is 90%, I think. Let me check. 70% of its total extension. In other words, the joystick is now hard all the way to the top, so he's walking up, or hard all the way to the left. But until it's all the way extended, it doesn't start moving. So I wanted to have the ability to move, not move, and yet still aim. So I can aim.
Oh, you don't want the character jumping around all the time while you're trying to...
Yeah, I don't want to be constantly walking in the direction that the reticle is moving, because I may walk into enemies. What I'd really like to be able to do is sit here and go, change my aim without walking. That gives me a lot more control.
Okay. Is that a pretty common problem? I mean, did you have to think that out, or what?
Oh yeah, this is one of those things where it didn't even. Let me pause, or die. Just let him die. It is a common problem, but it doesn't always arise because this game doesn't follow the traditional top-down shooter recipe, where it's not a twin-stick shooter. So with a twin-stick shooter, you're almost always moving 100%. If you pick up the game Geometry Wars and you play that for a bit, you'll be using the left joystick to move around, and I guarantee you're going to find yourself not paying any attention to how far that joystick is moving. You're just like, well, if I move to the right, I want to move 100% velocity to the right, 100 velocity to the left, etc. And then your other joystick, your right joystick, is doing the firing, and so whatever direction that joystick points in is where your bullets will go. So you can be moving to the left, but firing to the right.
So the decisions that you've made are not necessarily driven by the fact that you're using a controller, but they're driven by how you want the game to play.
Yeah, they're driven by the fact originally this game I could use the mouse and change my orientation but never walk. And I had another key for walking. And so I had to decide, do I just use the reticle in this case to decide that I'm walking? I mean, decide that I'm aiming? Or do I want the joystick to do aiming and movement? It's like doing a double purpose. So now, whereas with our previous setup, we could only aim with the reticle, now we can, in a sense, move with the reticle. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So, and that's where the last variable comes in. If it wasn't apparent, I have a variable here called moveLen, and basically when the vector that represents the joystick axis is at 70%, the length is 0.7 or greater, then the character will start moving. And so let me take a look. Let me show you this code. The important bit that I wanted to show you today has really nothing to do with our game. It's actually something that people get tripped up on all the time with the axis. So what you're going to see when you look at this game code is you're going to see that in Player Maker, I never find stuff when I'm looking for it. There it is. You're going to see an event called onLeftJoystick. Now that's a custom event that I created and I dispatch. It's a runtime event that I send out like I do on SFX and on left, on right. I use all these custom events because I like to separate my code that handles processing from my code that does work. So that way the player code doesn't have to know about the input module. They can just talk via events. And another reason I did this is because the traditional way of getting the joystick axis is through the axis event. And so there is an event that you can listen for called axis right here. And you would normally say something like runtime add event listener axis. And then you can tell it the function that is your listener. Now, the problem with axis is you have to understand that an axis is one axis on the joystick. It's the x-axis or the y-axis. And it could be joystick 1 or joystick 2. So for a controller, there's 4 axes for 2 joysticks. And in fact, let me go back to my camera here for a minute. If you look at, okay, so what I'm saying here is this joystick has 2 axis events. This joystick has 2 axis events. And then it's a little bit hard to see them, but these buttons here on the hip or the shoulder, these are also axis events. And because the reason they are axis events is because, Corona, the guys I think decided that's the best way to pick them up. But they are analog events. They go between 0 and 255. That's their range. Whereas these axis events are, for each axis is between -1 and 1, approximately. It's not exactly accurate, and I'll talk to that in a minute. So back to the code. The reason why I create my own events is because if you think about it, let's get there. If you think about it, what good is knowing the X position of the joystick? You need the X and Y at the same time. Typically, when you want to move in a certain direction, you need the X and the Y component. But if only one is getting delivered at any one time, you gotta do some smart coding. So I personally don't like to use the axis event directly. Instead, what I do is I catch the axis event and then I create a record where I keep track of the last status of that joystick. For example, joystick 1, is it currently moved to the left? Okay, like I get an x-axis event, I update that. Then I get a y-axis event and I update that. And every time I get an event for that joystick, I send it out again as I send out I dispatch a left joystick or a right joystick event where I incorporate the last X and Y value that I recorded for that joystick. So then my code that processes joystick events always gets an X and a Y value, because if we think back, movement in the game is controlled by what? It's controlled by vectors. And a vector is totally useless with only one axis. You need both axes in a 2D environment to move either up, left, or right, down. I mean, you could move, theoretically, you could deal with one axis at a time, but I find it to be counterintuitive, because I know that I'm going to be doing vector calculations, etc., and only half a vector is no vector at all.